I had a pleasure on behalf of my co-investigators to present very exciting data from a study which tested a switch pocket inhibitor ripretinib of the KIT and PDGFR kinase using the intra-patient dose escalation in patients with gastrointestinal stromal tumor. Ripretinib, as I just pointed out, is a switch control inhibitor which is actually effective on a broad spectrum of KIT mutations, including mutations which are deemed to be resistant to other tyrosine kinase inhibitors inhibiting KIT. Ripretinib entered the clinical arena in the phase 1 clinical study in November 2015, and due to pretty fast drug development timeline, actually the FDA approved ripretinib for patients with gastrointestinal stromal tumor who failed 3 prior therapies or more in May of this year. So it was actually a very quick drug development timeline. The data which I presented at ESMO were extension of the initial phase 1 study, and that phase 1 study allowed patients who developed disease progression on the recommended phase 2 dose, which ultimately ended up being also the FDA approved dose. So these patients were actually allowed to escalate to ripretinib 150 milligrams twice a day, which is a dose which is twice as high as the FDA approved dose / recommended phase 2 dose in the study. And out of 142 patients who received recommended phase 2 dose 150 milligrams daily, ultimately 67 at progression were escalated to the dose of 150 milligrams twice a day. And quite interestingly, in these patients, we have seen quite meaningful progression-free survival. So if I can just point out the progression-free survival for the ripretinib 150 milligrams daily, which was 11 months for patients who received ripretinib in the second line, 8.3 months for patients who received ripretinib in the third line, and 5.5 months for patients who received ripretinib in 4 or more lines. In ripretinib 150 milligrams twice a day, so again, patients who already progressed on daily dosing, doubling the dose actually again led to quite meaningful progression-free survival, which was 5.6 months for the second line, 3.3 months for the third line, and 4.6 months for the 4th or more lines, which was actually quite intriguing. Responses were relatively infrequent after intra-patient dose escalation. We, in fact, have seen only one patient who attained PR after the dose was escalated, but also side effects were quite acceptable. So the side effect profile of daily dosing and analysis of daily and double dosing actually showed very similar side effect profile, not necessarily with any significant tendency to more AEs with the increased dosing. So I think our observation in summary suggests that escalation the dose of ripretinib at the time of disease progression can actually add some additional mileage in terms of progression-free survival and might be a meaningful strategy for patients developing adaptive resistance to ripretinib. Treatment emergent adverse events were acceptable. They were maybe slightly bit more frequent when we analyzed the twice-a-day dosing and once-a-day dosing together, but still in very similar ballpark. So I'm finding this concept quite interesting because essentially if you can get some additional progression-free survival just by increasing the dose, and that can be added on already meaningful progression-free survival with the daily dosing, I think this is actually something which can be potentially a very interesting strategy for these patients who otherwise have very limited treatment options.